be out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my space mobile, a supersonic honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull me out of this world with you. So away we'll steal in my space mobile, a supersonic honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull the...
Since the beginning of recorded history, the human race has been at war. First with members of their own family, then their fellow countrymen, and finally nations at large. Yet perhaps the starting ground for all these conflicts lays somewhere deeper, within the very character of the human condition, in the dark, untouchable crevices of the human heart. It is said that the first iniquity of free will began even before the maiden pilgrimage from the embryo, preceding the very creation of the earth itself, in the forelife of souls in the heavenly realms. The dawn of warfare, some believe, was initiated by a fallen angel whose trespass against God was pride. In ancient Babylonia, in of the human race, a tower so tall that its summit would reach the heavens, and by it prove to the world that their race was superior. It would be God's irony that it would never be finished. Time passed, nations fell, a machine age emerged, and once again the ingenuity of the species which held dominion over all others unveiled what was at the time the most monumental accomplishment ever imagined, the largest machine yet constructed, an automation so mammoth and so revered even before its first demonstration that its only befitting name was Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it set sail. It was boasted to be the ship that God himself could not sink. It would be God's irony that the very element that was meant to keep it afloat would cause it to sink. Water, frozen water, in the form of an iceberg. Not even one voyage did it complete. And then the next age embarked into the annals of human history, perhaps the last age, the space age. Competition for victor was unparalleled. Powerful nations spent billions in unabashed rivalry to outdo the other. Irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
Trip in my rocket ship. We'll have a lovely afternoon. Kiss the world goodbye, and away we'll fly. Destination moon. We'll travel fast as a light till we're out of sight. The earth will be like a toy balloon, What a thrill you'll get riding on my jet, a destination moon. We'll go up, 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 straight to the moon we two, high in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you, so away we'll steal in my space mobile, a supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull the switch, let's go, a destination moon. We'll go up, 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 straight to the moon we two. We'll be high in the starry blue. I'll be out of this world with you, so away we'll steal in my jet mobile, a supersonic, a honeymoon. Leave your cares below, pull that switch, let's go, destination. We're flying high up in the sky, destination, destination moon.
Dr. von Braun, how would you say we stand in relation to the Russians, and do you think we can ever catch up?
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability, and that at the moment the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We've got to have no finite end to our objectives. The end of our objectives should be as far as we can see at any given time. But right now, we need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters
which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about US military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about US strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it.
You know, explaining how the Building 7 had collapsed 23 minutes before it collapsed, and you can see the building in the background over her left shoulder. If that isn't a shocking display of the potential involvement of the mass media with intelligence agencies and the U.S. government, I can't imagine what would be. I thought that would be a story that would make every newspaper and television program in the country, but of course it was passed over largely in silence. Yes. Yes, I have several reports that there were in fact elevated tritium levels. I try to keep the latest that I come across archived on a block on the 9/11 Scholars website regarding mini nukes. It bothers me profoundly that Steve Jones claimed that a dust sample he analyzed had only very low levels of tritium, because tritium has a very low half-life, and it would have, most of it would have decayed by that point in time. So I'm very troubled that Steve Jones' attitude here appears to me to be highly unscientific. Not only that, but he claims to have a dust sample that he can track back to the 80th floor of the South Tower. Anyone who deals with dust knows that it's non-specific in its origins, and yet he uses a diagram that purports to show the exact path this dust took from the South Tower into this woman's apartment. Frankly, I find that at the least faintly absurd. Thanks for the call, Bob. Good questions.
He's taking phone calls? It's good. He knows his stuff.
I can't hear her at all. I think she's on a cell phone and is breaking up. If you can figure out what her question is, just relay it to me. Totally garbled. I have no idea what this guy's saying. You better spell that one out for me, because I couldn't make out a word of it. Oh.
I'm going, Molly. Are you okay?
Well, let me pick up on this, because there actually is a very important issue here. If it was a conventional explosive like thermite, they can be purchased on eBay. Anyone can have done it. If it was some kind of high-tech weapon derived from the Star Wars research program, for example, that directly implicates the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon and its advanced research projects. So I think that if, in fact, it was non-conventional explosives or mechanisms here that were used to bring about the pulverization of the towers and these weird effects in the World Trade Center, it's a far more powerful indictment of governmental complicity than would emerge from any combination of conventional explosives. So there's a political dimension to this as well as the basic scientific issue.
I was just buying the thermite thing, not this whole thing's going. I was just buying the thermite deal, but now this whole thing is thermite based. I'm not gonna win. Yeah, I was just getting into a thermite. Yeah, something else. Pure thermite. No, now we're at the beams.
What you're talking about, which is why I emphasize that activists ought to focus on all of our disproofs. If you go to 9/11 Scholars, look at Why Doubt 9/11, which is an inventory of about 20 proofs we have that the government's account is false. Even when I submitted a letter to the Nation in response to an article they had published in December that was suggesting that 9/11 researchers were paranoid, what I did in my letter, which I was delighted that they published in their February 2007 issue, was enumerate disproofs of the government's account. Trying to figure out how it was actually done is a much more difficult, challenging, and messy business. But it must go on if we want to have scientific answers to these extremely important problems. We're dealing with one of the great mass murder mysteries of history, what the President himself has described as the pivotal event of the 21st century. We need to figure out exactly how it was done, as well as why it was done and by whom it was done, and that's a challenging task that we have yet to completely successfully resolve. I realize that because, you know, your gullibility or your skepticism is a function of your background knowledge and understanding, and that the American public in general is mostly scientifically illiterate and doesn't even understand the 10th grade level physics involved in proving that the government's account of the what they call collapse of the towers can't possibly be correct. But this is where we have to do our best to educate them and inform them, and this is even at the level of just showing what's wrong with the government's account. If you understand the difference between temperatures of 2,800 degrees and 1,800 degrees, or between 2,000 degrees and 500 degrees, you begin to get an inkling of how the government's account can't possibly be correct. And those are temperatures, by the way, including that the fires actually were burning around 500 degrees that you even get from the National Institute for Standards and Technology's own account. So in fact, the NIST's own evidence contradicts the NIST's own conclusions, which are based on massive begging of the question, taking for granted that since the buildings did collapse, in their phrase, even though that's a misdescription, it must have been the case that the fires and the impact of the plane were sufficient to bring it about. They do not have a serious investigation or study of what actually happened here, and in fact their own data contradicts their own conclusion. Ridiculous charade. I can hardly imagine a serious report that is posed as scientific, including so many blatant flaws and inconsistencies as the NIST report. So I say activists, I completely agree with this, activists should set how it was actually done to one side and emphasize all of the disproofs that show the government's account is false. I endorse that completely, but that doesn't mean that the scientific investigation won't continue. And I think those who want to pay attention to what's going on simply need to be serious about it, do their homework, and not allow themselves to be affected by rumor and speculation that has no basis in fact.
The World Trade Center burning.
Half the people in this country don't even know how to spell the word degree. Well, let me tell you how bad it is. I actually had even sent Mark Dice a copy of the book. He had it on Friday. He told me he was going to read through it on Saturday and Sunday. He obviously hadn't done his homework. He would never have come on the way he did. And Mark Dice is somebody who has a special place in the 9/11 archives because of his resistance manifesto, because of his interview with Christine Ebersol, because she mentioned it on Rosie. I mean, that created a sensation. And yet for him to be so irresponsible as to buy into all these rumors and speculations and ignorance-based attacks upon me and Judy Wood and Morgan Reynolds was completely irresponsible. If he wants to be taken seriously, he's going to have to do better than that. That's okay with me, because I think that activists should emphasize all of our disproofs. I mean, once people become convinced that the government can't possibly be defended, then they may start raising questions in their own mind about how it was actually done. This is where I think the 9/11 conspiracy book that has just appeared is very successful in that regard, because it really is predominantly emphasizing all the evidence we have that not only is the government's account not defensible from an objective scientific point of view, but that the government had motive, means, and opportunity. I mean, the essays about why the government would do this are simply superb. It does not talk about, other than as a possibility, the idea of directed energy weapons, and Morgan Reynolds' essay is extremely carefully constructed. I only hope that the readers are equal to the book. Look forward to it. Opportunity. I mean, the essays about why the government would do this are simply superb. It does not talk about, other than as a possibility, the idea of directed energy weapons, and Morgan Reynolds' essay is extremely carefully constructed. I only hope that the readers are equal to the book.